Terry Teegee, Regional Chief of the British Columbia Assembly of First Nations. I'm from Tackle Lake First Nations, from the Wolf Clan, Luxjibu Clan. So through the BCAFN, more or less we are one of the 10 regions that represent First Nations across this country. More importantly, our job is to advocate on behalf of our First Nations communities. There's well over 634 communities, First Nations communities in this country. Approximately 203 First Nations communities in British Columbia. And what we do as a regional chief is really advocate and support our First Nations communities, chiefs, and more importantly, our people in terms of asserting rights, title, and in many respects bringing justice to many different issues that our people are really trying to deal with within their daily lives. BCAFN is one of three provincial territorial organizations in British Columbia, the other two being the Union of BC Indian Chiefs and the other being First Nations Summit. And together we're collectively known as the First Nations Leadership Council, where we work together, not only pooling our technical resources, but also coming together politically to advocate on behalf of our First Nations communities in British Columbia. Working with the national office, we're really trying to create changes in regards to acknowledgement of First Nations making their own decisions, and that's really important in terms of the way it previously existed. There was no acknowledgement of our jurisdiction, of our ability to make decisions. So right now, the changes that we've been proposing and supporting is to support First Nations in terms of across this country. In April of this year, an MOU, a Memorandum of Understanding, was signed with the government of British Columbia and also the federal government to work better together in terms of emergency management. The last couple of years were the worst years we've seen in our recorded history in terms of fires, and many of the wildfires affected many First Nations communities in British Columbia. A lot of our people were evacuated to urban centers, and right now a lot of our communities have to deal with the issues of mitigating future emergency issues. So right now, what we have to do is create these conditions so our communities can better prepare for future emergencies, whether it's floods, fires, or seismic activities, or potential destruction of the coastal lines because of man-made issues such as tanker traffic, and I think that's really important. So I think, you know, the relationship that exists now with the province of BC is one of it's pretty much the only relationship in this country where we have a very positive relationship. Whether it's creating new legislation such as British Columbia environmental assessment legislation, or the commitment to start developing child welfare legislation, and also in the future legislation to implement the United Nations Declaration for the Rights of Indigenous People. And in the last year, we've had a positive movement in terms of reconciling many past issues. Revenue sharing with gaming is a very positive step. We're one of the few jurisdictions, one of the few provinces that have revenue sharing similar to Saskatchewan and Ontario. And also the commitment towards on and off reserve housing, approximately $500 million, and also $50 million put towards saving our languages. Will really support our First Nations communities in saving our languages. This, along with the commitment from the federal government to implement federal legislation on languages, and the future commitment on implementing provincial languages legislation, it bodes well for our First Nations communities in British Columbia so we can save our languages, and that's really important. So our relationship right now is a very positive place. As with any relationship, there could be improvements. So I certainly hope over the next few years we continue to improve this relationship with the province of British Columbia. My national file is economic development. Within the mandate of taking care of this file, the issues that are underneath the file is gaming revenue sharing and gaming issues, and also cannabis in terms of dealing with the issue of recreational use of cannabis and also medicinal uses as part of your economic development portfolio. And since the legalization of cannabis has occurred approximately a year ago, there are still unresolved issues that many First Nations communities across this country are trying to deal with. Also, a part of my national files on economic development is human resources and training. And as we transition from assets to ISETs, it's really important that we get the proper resourcing over the next few years and commitments over the 5-10 years with what is now known as ISETs. And what we're looking for is consistent and predictable resourcing, meaning that as our population increases and also as inflation increases, that the funding increases as well. So over the last year, we were really looking from the national office to implement a chapter within the NAFTA 2, or what is now known as the Canadian-United States Mexican agreement, and it is far better than the first NAFTA, and there is recognition of our First Nations ability to have trade agreements. Further to that, we are working on different forms of trade and within our Indigenous people across the borders in the United States and other regions, for example, New Zealand. And we're looking at different Indigenous trade zones. Perhaps we can freely trade within these Indigenous trade zones. That the idea is to create a trade network with our First Nations communities in Canada, and also with the United States tribes and Indigenous people in New Zealand and perhaps elsewhere. So that's really early in its development and trying to create these trade networks, and that could be an opportunity in the future for economic development. So within the justice file, the national file, I think it's really important to acknowledge the issues of many of our First Nations people that are overrepresented within the judicial system. Here in British Columbia, we certainly know that First Nations aren't properly resourced in terms of representation. We as Indigenous people are overrepresented within the incarceration of Indigenous people within the many jails within British Columbia. So I think moving ahead, it's really important that as part of the justice file that we continue to work with our many First Nations organizations, in particular the BC First Nations Justice Council, and to better understand and to, I think, to create conditions that our people can be properly represented, and perhaps we can deal with the systemic issues of many of our people that are in that constant cycle of being incarcerated. Part of the justice file, it's really important to acknowledge also the injustice that are happening to our people. In particular, we've seen over the last few decades how the miscarriage of justice of many of our Indigenous women, the many that have been missing or murdered. And the current National Inquiry, which many First Nations communities were involved with, our organizations were involved with as the AFN, BCAFN, to come up with finding solutions to change these conditions for our Indigenous women and girls. I think the 231 recommendations need to be upheld. They need to be properly resourced by the many levels of government to to be really implemented. And I think those recommendations are good recommendations that have a purpose. And the purpose is to make those changes needed for the many Indigenous women and girls to be safe, to be in a place that respects them. And I think that's really important. So I look forward over the next year to continue to work hard for our First Nations communities in British Columbia and to continually to advocate and support our First Nations. And these are some of the things that we're working at BCAFN. And also too that acknowledge that perhaps things may change in the future. And we need to be willing to go to those places that are difficult and have those discussions that are difficult. And as we move forward together. And collectively, I think the stronger we are. And proud to represent British Columbia. We're pretty much the only region in this country that have the province of British Columbia at the table, the provincial government, and also the federal government to talk about these many matters that are really important to all our First Nations people in British Columbia.